Chile was once a small Spanish colony around Santiago that became a country encompassing thousands of kilometers of South America's Pacific coast. As such, it has a widely disparate geography that has always played an important role in its history and everyday life of Chileans. To see why, join me for this brief look at the political geography of Chile. Chile is only the 37th largest country in the world, but this fails to capture how colossal it is, because while its width is tiny, its length is massive. Its thickest point in the north, for example, the bulge just east of Antofagasta, is just under 500 kilometers or a little over 300 miles, a trip which would translate to just over 6 hours to go from the coast to the Argentine border. Its length, however, is roughly 4,000 kilometers or around 2,500 miles. That means that if one would place one end of the country in Maine, the other end would reach Venezuela. Or if you prefer, if you place one end in Oslo, Norway, the other tip would end up in the Sahara at the border with Niger. A significant portion of that land are cities. Chile is the fourth most urbanized country in South America, with a higher proportion of people in cities than the US, Australia, or Canada. Much of it is also mountainous, as the Andes provide a natural eastern border along its entire length. That makes it the country with the highest average elevation in the Americas and the 8th highest country in the world, at 1871 meters or 6,138 feet on average. The vast differences in latitude and elevation also translate to huge differences in climate and vegetation, making the country one with a vast array of climate zones and microclimates, which range from high desert to ice-capped tundra. Thus, there are at least 11 ecoregions in the country. But over time, and for simplicity's sake, the Chilean government collapsed them into 5. These are Nortegrande, or far north, Norte Chico, or near north, Zona Central, or central zone, Zona Sur, or south zone, and the Zona Austral, or Austral Zone. Out of these, the least populated and most remote is the Austral Zone. Its largest city is Punta Arenas on the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego, with a population of around 125,000, which also makes it the most populated southernmost city in the Americas. The area is windy and cold, and its terrain is mountainous and heavily forested with evergreen broadleaf trees, making up what are known as Magellanic subpolar forests. The zone also sees heavy precipitation, which gives rise to numerous lakes and rivers, including the largest lake in Chile, Lake General Carrera, and one considered among the top 10 most beautiful lakes in the world, Lake Chiloe. The coastline, meanwhile, the product of ancient receding glaciers, is a ragged affair full of islands, thousands of them, that create numerous archipelagos full of inlets and fjords, and historically made the region difficult to access, especially in the Aysén area, which was quite difficult to traverse north to south until the construction of the Southern Highway in the 1980s. Its isolation and lack of population made it an ideal site to create Chile's largest national park, the Bernardo O'Higgins, which spans 8 million acres and is so remote that it can only be accessed by boat or helicopter. Not that that stops people from visiting its 2 main attractions, the Última Esperanza Sound and the Pio 11th Glacier. Interestingly, it was in this zone that Europeans first laid eyes on Chilean territory. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan and his men came on an expedition trying to find a southern passage to the Pacific Ocean, and they found it when they stumbled upon what is now called the Strait of Magellan. The finding would set up a route that would retain importance until the building of the Panama Canal in 1914, but would not be a beachhead for Spanish colonialism. The first major city, Punta Arenas, would not be founded until 1848. The South Zone is the next region. Its climate is milder than the Austral Zone and is covered with Valdivian temperate rainforests, which have more diverse flora and fauna than their southern cousins, with some cool animals like the Monito del Norte, a tiny nocturnal marsupial, and the pudu, the world's smallest deer. The region is also full of bodies of water. In fact, it has the Biobío, the widest and second longest river in the country, the only navigable rivers like the Calle River near the city of Valdivia, and the most lakes, including Lake Yanquihue, the biggest lake entirely within Chilean territory. The largest island in Chile is also in this zone. That would be Chiloe, an area that has had its own history distinct from the mainland. During colonial times, for instance, Chiloe was directly dependent on the Viceroyalty of Peru, not Santiago. and once the Wars of Independence came, it was a royalist stronghold that did not join the Republic of Chile until 1826. This zone also encompasses the Araucanía, the traditional lands of the Mapuche, a native people that provided stiff resistance to Spanish colonization and still make up the largest number of indigenous people in the country. Starting in the 1550s and accelerating with a key victory for the Mapuche at the Battle of Curalaba and the destruction of the 7 cities in 1598, this area became the traditional frontier zone between colonial Chile and the Mapuche lands to the south. It would not be until the period between 1861 and 1883 that the Chilean state incorporated these lands by force, which in turn led to a precipitous drop in the Mapuche population and subsequently to the encouragement of European migration to the area. The next region is the Central Zone. This area encompasses the 3 major urban centers in the country: Santiago, Valparaíso, and Concepción. It has a pleasant Mediterranean climate where the average temperature in the summer is in the high 80s and in the winter in the high 50s Fahrenheit. It also has some of the richest agricultural land in the country in the Central Valley, which is used to produce fine wines and fruits. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, odds are good that if you are eating peaches, grapes, or apples in the winter, they're grown here. This area has always been and remains the political, economic, and cultural center of the country, and thus, unsurprisingly, was the birthplace for some of the most prominent Chileans, including Pablo Neruda, Violeta Parra, Roberto Bolaño, and so on, as well as many historical events of note. For instance, the first attempt at Chilean independence occurred in Concepción in 1811, Latin America's oldest stock exchange and oldest continuous Spanish newspaper in the world are both in Valparaíso, while the oldest university in the country, the University of Chile, and the major political power disputes in Chilean history all happened in and around Santiago. The region also has history you can taste. One of Chile's most prominent national dishes, a classic South American comfort food known as Charakikan, is typical of the area. The dish is a potato and jerky stew originally made with llama meat and historically popular with peasants and soldiers. Today you can eat it all over Chile, but according to the country's PR firm Marca Chile, the best place is in Pichilemu during the festival of Cochayuyo. The following region is the Norte Chico, a semi-arid zone that begins just north of Santiago. The temperatures are mild and it's one of the least populated zones in the country, with only a handful of major cities like Copiapó and La Serena. The subsequent lack of light pollution makes it ideal for astronomy, and thus this region has multiple important telescopes including La Silla and Las Campanas observatories. Once part of the Inca Empire, it was through this region that the Spanish first began their colonization of Chile. First with a major expedition under Diego de Almagro in 1535, and 5 years later a conquest mission under Pedro de Valdivia, who claimed Coquimbo for the Spanish. The Europeans found a mountainous area dotted with valleys where they would develop mining and various agricultural products. That hasn't changed much since then. One of them, the Elqui Valley, is famous for its production of wine and pisco, a colored brandy typical of the region. And while copper mining has dwindled in importance from its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is still very much a part of the economic mix in the area. The region is also famous for being the cradle of prominent writers and poets, like Victor Domingo Silva, notable for his patriotic poems like Al Pie de la Bandera. But the most famous by far is Gabriela Mistral, the first Latin American author to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1945, who first became known for her Sonetos de la Muerte, or Sonnets of Death. The final zone is the Nortegrande. This area is extremely arid as it's mostly covered by the Atacama Desert, the driest desert in the world. In fact, this place so lacks moisture that NASA has used the site to emulate the conditions on Mars. TV and movies have done as well, most notably in the TV show Space Odyssey. Some areas are so extreme that no living thing can survive, but that is not the entire region, of course. There have been multiple species that have figured out a way to adapt to extreme conditions, and not just in the oases created by the few rivers that mark the landscape, like the Loa River or Rio Salado. Most common are desert grasses like the jareta and cacti like the candelabro, and animals that exist nowhere else, such as Fabian's lizard. Of course, that also includes humans who have settled here. In fact, the biggest city in the region, Antofagasta, is the 5th largest in the country. The reason for its size is mostly as a result of its importance as a shipping port of Chile's copper wealth, which is heavily concentrated in the area. 2 of the largest open pit mines in the world, Chuquicamata and La Escondida, for instance, are a couple hours' drive from Antofagasta. The mining industry has historically made the region an important component of the Chilean labor movement, with unions like the Federación Obrera de Chile, or FOCH, present among the saltpeter workers as early as the mid-1910s. It has also made this area quite prosperous. Today, it has some of the highest GDP in the country. The Antofagasta political region in particular is so high that it is comparable to Norway. Nonetheless, its status as a Chilean territory is controversial. Well, at least among Bolivians and Peruvians. That is because the regions of Arica and Tarapacá used to belong to Peru, while Antofagasta used to belong to Bolivia. That they don't anymore is the result of a catastrophic loss for Bolivia and Peru during the War of the Pacific, a conflict that lasted from 1879 to 1884. The war ended with the occupation of Lima by the Chileans and the cession of this region to Chile. Because this made Bolivia permanently landlocked, it is still a source of tension between the two countries, and the Andeans continue to demand those lands be given back. In the meantime, still part of the Chilean territory but not quite integral parts of any of the natural zones discussed here are two notorious groups of islands. The first are the Juan Fernandez Islands, an archipelago off the coast of Valparaiso, famous because this was the site where a sailor, Alexander Selkirk, was marooned for several years and would later inspire the story of Robinson Crusoe. And the second is Easter Island, an archipelago over 3,500 kilometers or 3,000 miles from the Chilean coast, famous for its monumental statues. It would take a whole video to explain how Easter Island came to be part of Chile, but the short story is that it was annexed by the Chilean government in 1888 and it has controlled the islands ever since. Today it is a special territory in a province within the Valparaiso region. Meanwhile, the statues, known as moai, are human figures carved between 1200 and 1500 by the Rapa Nui, a Polynesian people that still live on the island. At one point, all the statues were toppled but began to be restored since the mid-20th century, and today you can see them at the Rapa Nui National Park. Meanwhile, the basic political unit for Chile is the comuna, which roughly translates to commune, but would be better understood as a municipality. There are 346 of them, grouped into 56 provinces, which in turn are further aggregated into 16 regions. Because Chile is not a federal country, that argument was lost after a civil war early in the 19th century. Although the country does have a Senate, and this institution does represent regions, these are not represented equally but rather have numbers based on their population. Thus, Santiago, the most populated of the regions, has 4 senators, while Aysén, the least, only has 2. The regions differ widely in population and wealth. The most and least populated, as already mentioned, are Santiago and Aysén, while the second most and least populated are Valparaiso and Magallanes at the tip of Tierra del Fuego. And while Antofagasta has the highest GDP per capita in the country, the lowest is Araucanía, with a figure comparable to El Salvador. In part, this is due to education because while the people of Antofagasta and Santiago have on average the same amount of years of schooling, 11.8, Araucanía has barely 9.3, although Maule, 2 regions north, is even worse at 9.1. As far as a political pattern, after the return to democracy, the political contest has been a very clear left-to-right competition, but this hasn't always translated geographically, with some exceptions. The city of Antofagasta, for instance, has always voted left, starting with the 1989 plebiscite that asked whether Augusto Pinochet should stay or should go. And this concludes our trip through the Chilean landscape. I hope you can see for yourself someday.